Welcome to WikiPodcast.
Great to be diving into this.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into the life and teachings of Socrates. He's such a pivotal figure, often credited as, well, the founder of Western philosophy.
Absolutely. And this is the third part of our mini-series on elementary thought, focusing right on him.
Exactly. We're trying to navigate the fascinating but really complex picture of this enigmatic Athenian, someone who remarkably left no writings of his own.
Which is the first big challenge, isn't it? Everything we think we know comes secondhand.
Right. We'll be drawing mainly from his students, Plato and Xenophon, but also looking at insights from people like Aristophanes, his contemporary, and later thinkers like Aristotle.
It's like putting together a puzzle with pieces from different boxes.
Yeah, our mission today is to sort of unpack his key ideas, his famous method, the pretty dramatic circumstances of his trial and death.
And his huge, lasting impact on philosophy. It's enormous.
And we'll have to touch on that inherent challenge, the sometimes contradictory sources, what scholars call the Socratic problem.
Definitely. You mentioned he didn't write anything. So the obvious question for you listening is, where do we start? How do we know anything?
That's precisely the Socratic problem. Our knowledge is built entirely on these posthumous accounts.
Primarily Plato and Xenophon, as you said, but also Aristophanes, the playwright.
Who wrote comedies, not history.
Exactly. And then Aristotle, who came a bit later, Plato's student. These are our main windows.
And these accounts, well, they don't always line up, do they? That's what makes reconstructing his actual philosophy so difficult.
It really is. Aristotle actually gave a name to this style of writing that Plato, especially, used logos Socraticos, Socratic dialogues.
Like a literary genre based on question and answer?
Precisely. It wasn't just stating facts, it was showing a process of thinking. But then how much of that is a real Socrates talking and how much is, say, Plato's interpretation or even his own ideas?
That's the million drachma question, isn't it? People often talk about the Socratic Socrates in Plato's early dialogues
Maybe closer to the historical figure.
versus the Platonic Socrates in the later works, who sounds a lot more like, well, Plato.
Yeah, that distinction is pretty common in scholarship. Then you've got Xenophon. His Socrates seems maybe less intensely philosophical.
A bit more down to earth, perhaps. I know Xenophon admired his character, his self-control.
Right. Xenophon really emphasizes Socrates' enkratia, that self-mastery, inner strength. His accounts in the Memorabilia or his own apology paint a picture of a practical, patriotic, virtuous man, less focused on the intricate logical arguments, maybe.
And Aristophanes. In the clouds, that's just pure caricature, surely.
Largely, yes. He portrays Socrates as sort of bumbling sophist and atheist obsessed with, like, studying gnats and clouds as comedy.
Though didn't Plato's Phaedo mention Socrates having some interest in natural philosophy early on? Maybe a tiny grain of truth?
Possibly, possibly. But Aristophanes' goal was laughs, not accuracy. It tells us more about Socrates' public perception, or how he could be lampooned.
It sounds like a minefield for historians. Even later scholars argued about the sources. Didn't Schleiermacher criticize Xenophon?
He did, yeah. Back in the 19th century. Schleiermacher thought Xenophon was maybe a bit naive, perhaps didn't fully get the philosophical depth, and was mostly just trying to defend his friend's reputation after the execution.
And others, like Vlastos, pointed towards early Plato as more reliable.
Gregory Vlastos, yes. He argued the Socrates of Plato's early dialogues is our best bet for the historical figure. Charles Kahn went even further, suggesting maybe only Plato's Apology, the trial defense, has significant historical value.
Wow. So the debate continues. It really underscores how tricky this whole Socratic problem is for anyone trying to understand him.
Absolutely. It's central to any study of Socrates.
Okay, so despite all that source difficulty, what can we piece together about his actual life, his biography?
Well, the basics seem fairly solid. Born in Athens around 470, maybe 469 BC.
To Sophroniscus, a stoneworker.
And Phaedrate, who was a midwife. An interesting detail Plato sometimes plays on.
Right, Socrates as a midwife of ideas. Did he come from poverty or...?
Probably not abject poverty. Likely a reasonably comfortable background for an Athenian citizen of that time. He got a standard Athenian education, reading, writing, gymnastics, music, poetry, the usual stuff.
And he had a family life. Xanthippe, his wife, is almost famous in her own right.
Infamous, perhaps, in later tradition. Yes, married to Xanthippe. There's some historical noise about a possible second wife, Myrto, but that's disputed. He definitely had 3 sons with Xanthippe.
So he wasn't just wandering around philosophizing all day. He had responsibilities.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And he fulfilled his duties as a citizen. He served in the Peloponnesian War. Plato and others mention his bravery in several key campaigns. Potidæa, Delium, Amphipolis.
That's important context. He wasn't detached from the city struggles.
Not at all. He was an active participant. And he showed civic courage, too, not just military. Resisting the 30 tyrants is a key example.
The oligarchy that ruled Athens briefly after the war.
Exactly. They ordered him and others to arrest an innocent man, Leonis Elminion. Socrates just went home, refused to participate. A very risky move.
That tells you something about his principles.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And clearly he attracted a lot of attention in Athens, especially from the young men.
Why was that, do you think? Just his ideas.
His ideas were central, of course, but also his whole persona. His appearance was apparently quite unconventional. You know, the flat nose, bulging eyes, maybe a bit of a belly. His friends teased him about it.
Not the image of a typical Greek hero.
Not at all. And then there was his complete indifference to material things. Neglected his hygiene sometimes, walked around barefoot, wore the same ragged coat year-round.
That must have stood out. It suggests his focus was entirely elsewhere.
Completely. On the soul, on virtue, on knowledge. He wasn't an ascetic, though. He practiced moderation, enjoyed food, drank, social gatherings, but wasn't excessive.
And his relationships with younger men, that's often mentioned.
It is, and it was a feature of Athenian society then. But the sources, especially Plato and Xenophon, emphasize his aim was to educate their souls, improve their character, not pursue physical relationships. He saw himself as improving them intellectually.
Okay. What about his politics? We mentioned his criticism of the 30 tyrants. Was he anti-democratic, pro-oligarchy?
It's complicated. He was certainly critical of Athenian democracy as it was practiced, the decisions made by potentially ignorant majorities, the influence of rhetoricians.
He wasn't a fan of politicians, it seems.
Generally not. But he also wasn't actively plotting against democracy or promoting oligarchy. He never held office, never proposed legislation. His politics was more about improving the individual citizen through philosophy.
A kind of moral politics.
You could put it that way. He obeyed the laws, did his military service, but engaged critically in the public square through dialogue.
Which tragically led to his trial and death in 399 BC. What were the official charges again?
The indictment had two main parts, asabia or impiety.
Which meant?
Not believing the city's God and introducing new daimonic things, basically religious nonconformity. And the second charge was corrupting the youth.
Serious accusations. Who brought them?
Three main accusers. Meletus, a rather obscure poet, Anytus, a powerful politician, maybe the main driver, and Lycon, an orator.
And the trial was quick.
Astonishingly quick, just one day. And the verdict, reached by a large jury of male citizens, was guilty. A majority voted against him.
Then came the sentencing. His proposed penalty was quite something, wasn't it?
It really was. Instead of suggesting exile or a fine he could realistically pay, his first proposal, according to Plato, was free meals for life at the Prytaneum.
The place where Olympic victors and city benefactors were honored.
Exactly. He argued his service to Athens, stinging them into self-examination, deserved that level of recognition. He also offered a tiny fine one, Mina saying that's all he had. Later, his friends apparently offered to increase it substantially, but the damage was done.
That must have seemed incredibly arrogant to the jury.
Almost certainly. It likely sealed his fate. They rejected his proposals and voted for the death penalty.
Death by hemlock. Why do you think it came to that? Was it purely the religious charges or more political? The timing seems significant.
Very significant. Athens was in a vulnerable state. Just recovered from defeat by Sparta, the trauma of the 30 tyrants, the restoration of a somewhat fragile democracy. It was a tense atmosphere.
So maybe Socrates, with his questioning and his associations with figures like Alcibiades or Critias, who were controversial.
Exactly. He became a target. The religious charges were likely genuine concerns for some, his talk of a daimonium, his questioning of traditional myths, but political resentment probably played a big role too. His criticism of democracy, his perceived elitism, it was likely a mix.
A dangerous cocktail of religious anxiety and political score settling.
That's a good way to put it. Scholars debate the exact balance, but few think it was just one or the other. Religion and politics were so intertwined.
And in Plato's Apology, Socrates defends himself. He tackles those rumors head on, right? Being an atheist scientist or a money-grabbing sophist.
Yes, he refutes those claims directly. He insists he never intentionally corrupted anyone. How could aiming for virtue be corrupting?
He even calls himself a gift from the god to Athens, like a gadfly waking up a lazy horse.
A famous image. He argued his questioning, though annoying, was ultimately beneficial for the city's moral health. And he warned them killing him wouldn't stop the questions. His followers would just be harsher critics.
Yet even after the sentence, when his friends arranged an escape, He refused.
He did. Plato's Crito dialogue details this. Socrates argues that he has a kind of social contract with Athens. He's lived there his whole life, benefited from its laws, and now he must abide by them, even when they lead to an unjust outcome for him personally. Escaping would undermine the very laws he respected.
A principled stand right to the end, in his last words, about owing a rooster.
Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt. Asclepius was the god of healing. It's enigmatic, maybe suggesting death is a cure, or thanking the god for a peaceful death, or something else entirely. Interpretations vary.
A final puzzle. Okay, let's shift fully into his philosophy. The Socratic method, the elenchus, that's his trademark, isn't it?
Absolutely fundamental, especially prominent in those early Platonic dialogues. It's a method of cross-examination, a dialogue.
How does it work, typically?
Usually Socrates engages someone who claims to be an expert on something: virtue, piety, courage. He starts by asking for a definition.
What is piety, for example?
Exactly. Then, through a series of carefully targeted questions, he shows that the expert's own beliefs about the topic are actually contradictory or inconsistent with their initial definition.
So it reveals their lack of true understanding. It exposes ignorance.
Precisely. The goal isn't necessarily for Socrates to hand down the right answer, but to make the other person aware of their own confusion, to clear away false certainty. It's a process aimed at approaching truth through persistent questioning. He used it on himself, too.
It's not about teaching a doctrine, but testing opinions.
Right. Though scholars still debate its exact nature, was it purely destructive, just refuting, or did it have a constructive aim guiding towards better understanding? The debate continues.
And this ties into the priority of definition, the idea you need to define something first.
It seems closely linked. He consistently kicks off discussions by asking, what is X? He gathers examples, looks for the common quality, the essence, to establish a solid definition.
Maybe as a reaction against the sophists, who sometimes seem to argue that words like justice could mean whatever you wanted.
That's a plausible view. He was searching for stable, objective meanings for these crucial ethical terms. Again, there's debate on whether this strong emphasis originated purely with Socrates or if Plato developed it further.
Okay, then there's Socratic ignorance, his famous claim.
That I know nothing, or something to that effect. It's not a direct quote from Plato, but captures the idea.
But wait, sometimes he does seem to claim knowledge, right? Like knowing it's wrong to commit injustice.
Exactly. So it's not absolute skepticism, it's more nuanced. He's claiming ignorance primarily about the deep, comprehensive nature of ethical concepts, those definitions he's always seeking. He knows he hasn't grasped the full essence of virtue, justice, and so on.
So it's an awareness of the limits of his own wisdom.
Precisely. It could be partly ironic, partly pedagogical, a way to encourage others to question their own assumptions. Or maybe he distinguished between different levels of knowing, like maybe he felt certain about some basic moral truths, but lacked that deeper systematic philosophical understanding.
But the core message is clear. Admitting ignorance is the first step to wisdom.
That's the consensus, yes. Gregory Vlastos had a theory distinguishing between knowledge C, certain, infallible, which Socrates denied having, and knowledge E, what stands up to elenchus, which he might have claimed for some beliefs.
Interesting distinction, and Socratic irony fits in here too.
Definitely. It's all over Plato's dialogues. Socrates often seems to praise someone's wisdom or agree with a dubious statement in a way that subtly undermines it. It's often humorous, but with a serious point.
Like in the Euthyphro, when he heaps praise on Euthyphro for prosecuting his own father for impiety, while clearly thinking it's a questionable act.
Exactly. It makes you stop and think. Is he being serious? What's his real angle? Vlastos suggested it often involves saying something with a double meaning, one literal, one hidden. It grabs your attention, makes you question.
Let's move to eudaimonism and intellectualism. Big words, what do they mean in Socrates' context?
Eudaimonia is the Greek term for human flourishing, happiness, well-being. Socrates believed this is the ultimate goal that motivates all our actions. Everything we do because we think it will lead to our own good, our own eudaimonia.
Okay, that makes sense. And intellectualism.
Moral intellectualism is the idea that virtue is knowledge. To be good is to know what is good. And if you truly know what's good, you will automatically do it.
Which leads to that famous, maybe controversial idea, no one errs willingly.
Exactly, pulled from Plato's Protagoras. The idea is that when people do wrong, it's not because they choose evil knowing it's evil, but because they're ignorant. They mistakenly think that what they are doing is actually good for them in some way.
So wrongdoing stems from a cognitive error, not a failure of will.
That's the core of Socratic intellectualism. The intellect, if properly informed, guides our desires. Irrational passions or beliefs shouldn't override true knowledge. This raises questions about things like a crazy weakness of will, acting against your better judgment, and whether Socrates really thought that was impossible.
Fascinating. What about his religious views? We know they got him into trouble. Was he really an atheist or just unconventional?
The evidence suggests he wasn't an atheist. He talks about gods, participates in religious practices, refers to the divine. But he was definitely unconventional.
How so?
He challenged the traditional, often quite crude, anthropomorphic depictions of the gods in myths. He argued the gods must be inherently wise and just.
Which leads to the Euthyphro dilemma you mentioned earlier.
Right. Is something pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is pious? Socrates leans towards the latter, suggesting goodness is independent of divine whim. The gods themselves must conform to the good.
So, a more philosophical, rational approach to divinity.
Very much so. He affirmed belief in gods in the Apology, but his discussion of the afterlife there sounds quite agnostic. Maybe it's a sleep, maybe a migration of the soul. He doesn't claim to know for sure. Though in the Phaedo, written later, Plato has him arguing strongly for the soul's immortality.
And he believed in signs, oracles, and his daimonion.
Yes, that inner divine voice. He claimed it started in childhood. Crucially, it only ever warned him against doing something. It never gave positive commands.
Like telling him not to enter politics.
Exactly. What it was is debated. A metaphor for reason and intuition, a genuine mystical experience. Hard to say definitively. Xenophon even presents Socrates offering a kind of teleological argument, arguing for a divine creator based on the purposeful design in the universe.
So a complex religious picture, not atheist, but certainly not orthodox.
Definitely not orthodox. He also seemed to use God and gods, somewhat interchangeably, sometimes speaking monotheistically, sometimes polytheistically.
And this connects to his ideas on virtue and knowledge, that they are unified.
Yes, the idea that all virtues, courage, justice, temperance, wisdom, piety, are fundamentally one and the same thing, knowledge.
So if you have knowledge of the good, you have all the virtues.
That's the implication. And vice versa. If you lack one virtue, it's because you lack the underlying knowledge. People aren't truly courageous if they don't understand what is genuinely fearful and what isn't. That requires knowledge. No one errs willingly flows directly from this unity.
He tries to argue this in Protagoras, using courage as the example.
He does, trying to show that courage isn't just boldness, but knowledge of what should and shouldn't be feared.
What about love? Did Socrates have a philosophy of love?
Plato certainly gives him one, especially in the Symposium and Lysis. Historically, we know he had close, intense relationships, like with Alcibiades.
But Plato emphasizes the non-physical aspect.
Yes. In the Symposium, Alcibiades famously describes trying and failing to seduce Socrates, who was more interested in his soul's improvement. The Socratic theory of love, as presented by Plato, often starts with attraction to physical beauty, but ascends towards higher forms of beauty of souls, institutions, knowledge, culminating in the abstract form of beauty itself.
So love is ultimately a philosophical impulse, a desire for wisdom and immortality.
In that Platonic framework, yes. Love is seen as rational, a drive towards the good and the beautiful. In the Symposium, Socrates even attributes his knowledge of love to a priestess, Diotima, suggesting it's a profound, almost mystical understanding.
Interesting. Finally, his political philosophy. We touched on his criticisms, but did he have a positive vision?
Not a clearly defined system like Plato's Republic. As we said, he was wary of democracy's flaws and avoided direct political action in terms of holding office.
His focus was moral improvement.
Exactly. He seemed to believe that the goal of politics should be making the citizens better people, cultivating virtue. How that translates into specific structures is less clear from the sources directly attributed to him.
But his actions obeying the law, even when it condemned him, resisting the tyrant, speak volumes, don't they?
They do. Some see him as fundamentally loyal to Athenian law and therefore democratic in spirit. Others point to his criticisms and his association with oligarchic figures, maybe a kind of democratic republicanism, emphasizing civic virtue, or even an early proponent of civil disobedience against specific unjust commands, but not against the rule of law itself.
So no easy label fits him politically either.
Not really. His legacy is primarily philosophical, but his life intersected dramatically with Athenian politics.
And what a legacy. His death wasn't the end, was it? It was almost a beginning.
In terms of his influence, absolutely. He had an immense impact. Almost every Hellenistic philosophical school that followed Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, the Cynics, the Stoics, traced their lineage back to him in some way.
He really shifted the focus of philosophy, didn't he?
He did, from speculating about the nature of the cosmos, the pre-Socratic focus, to examining human life, ethics, knowledge, know thyself.
His immediate followers took his ideas in different directions, though.
Completely. You had Plato developing his theory of forms, Aristippus founding Cyrenaicism focused on pleasure, Antisthenes leading towards cynicism with its emphasis on virtue and austerity, all claimed Socrates as inspiration.
And later schools. Stoicism seems very Socratic.
Very much so. The Stoic emphasis on virtue is the only good, their use of reason, their focus on inner disposition, all echo Socrates. Platonism obviously claimed him. Even skepticism, particularly the academic skeptics, centered on Socratic ignorance.
Was anyone against him?
Oh yes. Epicureans and Pyrrhonian skeptics were often quite critical or dismissive.
And his influence spread beyond Greece.
It did. Socratic thought influenced philosophers in the Islamic Golden Age, where figures like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi tried to harmonize his ideas with Islamic theology.
Less influential in the Christian West during the Middle Ages.
Somewhat overshadowed by Aristotle and Plato, but he wasn't forgotten, especially in the Byzantine Empire. Then a major revival during the Renaissance.
And interpreted differently again.
Constantly reinterpreted. As a model citizen, a pro-Christian saint, a rationalist icon, early modern France debated his personal life. Hegel saw him as a pivotal figure, introducing the principle of subjective freedom.
Kierkegaard was fascinated by him too, wasn't he?
Deeply. Kierkegaard saw Socrates as his teacher, focusing on his irony, his indirect communication, his commitment to existence over abstract systems.
And Nietzsche had strong feelings.
Mostly negative. Nietzsche famously blamed Socrates and his rationalism for the decline of Greek tragedy and vitality. He saw Socrates as life-denying.
Wow. And even after World War II.
Thinkers like Hannah Arendt, Leo Strauss, Karl Popper saw him as an icon of individual conscience standing against totalitarianism or societal pressure. His relevance just keeps adapting.
So, as we've explored, Socrates remains somewhat shrouded in mystery, doesn't he? Largely because of the nature of the sources.
Yeah, the Socratic problem is always there.
Yet his influence on the path of Western philosophy is just undeniable. Huge.
Absolutely. From his relentless questioning, that Alenkos, to his focus on self-examination, on virtue, he really laid the groundwork for centuries of inquiry.
Inquiries that, still resonate today.
Definitely. That phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living, maybe his most famous line from Plato's Apology, is still such a powerful challenge, isn't it, to each of us?
It really is. What stands out to you most from this deep dive into Socrates, listening right now? What questions has it sparked for your own understanding of knowledge or ethics or, well, living an examined life?
And remember, this is really just scratching the surface. There's so much more depth in Plato's dialogues and Xenophon and all the scholarship trying to understand this monumental figure. We really encourage you to delve deeper if this caught your interest.
Thanks for listening. Write us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help us reach more listeners. Thank you and have an amazing day.